Everybody awake this morning? Amen. A few people, anyway. We started a few weeks ago a series called Starting Point because every one of you had a starting point, correct? Some of you were started on purpose. Some of you were by accident based upon, what your parents think. We had one of those about 6 years after our daughter. And it's like, oh, my first thought was diapers again. But God blessed. We had a lady that her husband worked at Walmart, and she went to the company store, and she found bags and garbage bags full of diapers. I don't think we bought one diaper for that third kid. Whew, man. But every one of us have a starting point, and we looked at the idea that faith has a starting point as well. And that's why I'm so excited about this series, because as we get into it, the story of faith has a starting point. All religious systems. Would you go ahead and start the slides for me, Chris? So, starting point, faith has a starting point. Go to the next slide for us. The three largest faith traditions, claim the same starting point. Most people don't know much about the history of Christianity. Unless you've purposely gone to a Bible school, took some history. I didn't even know the Dark Ages. I've heard about the Dark Ages, but I didn't realize that even spilled over, that was because of the church went dark. And so as we look into this, we'll understand more and more that as God wants to reach out to mankind, He did this through the story of faith. The interesting point, look at the next slide, is that the three largest faith traditions claim the same starting point in one man, Abraham. And as we look at this, these three faith traditions agree that somewhere in the ancient past, God created a wonderful world, that God spun this world into motion, and that He created a single man, Adam, and placed him on this world that He created. And He created Adam in His own image. And in that, all three faith traditions believe in Adam and Eve. Now, Jews believe in Adam and Eve because of Genesis account, and the relationship through Abraham. Muslims believe in Adam and Eve because of the Prophet Muhammad, 600 and something years after Jesus began his writings and pulled all this together. And then Christians believe in Adam and Eve, not necessarily because of the Genesis account, but because of Jesus. Jesus referred to Adam and Eve as real people. And we believe Jesus because He predicted His death, and He died, and He predicted His resurrection, and He rose again. So if somebody predicts their death and resurrection, we have a tendency to believe them, right? And so as we get into this, all three traditions, look at the next slide. In this, there is a story behind it that we can go to with Abraham and you when we look at the story of faith. Abraham appeared, about 2,600 years before Christ. And so as we look in this, let me take that back. About 1,800 years before Christ. Now, Abraham, Islam, and Judaism sort of go their separate ways at Abraham. Now, Islam didn't appear for 2,600 years after Abraham. 600 and something years after Christ, the Prophet Muhammad wrote, and kind of pulled everything together. Now, what's interesting to me is I've gone through this and looked and studied a lot of this, even Mormonism, and Jehovah's Witness, and a lot of other faith traditions have to deal with Jesus. The reason they have to deal with Jesus is because He was a real person. And because Christianity made such an influence during the Roman era, that the whole idea that even Rome wasn't taken over by another authority, another power, another country. In all reality, it was taken over by Christianity. And there's a lot of signs of that. If you go to Rome today, there's crosses everywhere. Not celebrating their style of death and execution of crucifixion, but celebrating the Christ who defeated death. So God's starting point, God's dilemma. To understand the story of Abraham, you first have to understand the dilemma that God found himself in. Now, understand, this is not like when Adam and Eve sinned that God went, oh no, what am I going to do now? No, he had a plan. But at some point, somewhere along in history, I mean, we know about the flood, and it got so bad that God started over, okay, with one family, Noah. And then from Noah, we find the genealogy leading to this one man, Abram. And for some reason, God chose Abram, and he came to him and says, I understand it's broken. And I see that you understand that it's broken, but I am going to fix it. I'm going to develop something that will help mankind come back into relationship with me, and I'm going to start it with a relationship with Abram. So as to get into this, maybe to help you to understand this, and I think we've all kind of dealt with this, especially if you're parents. There was a time when my daughter, she was in the kitchen putting up the dishes or something, and I was in another part of the house, and all of a sudden I heard glass break. Parents, have you heard glass break? Right? So I come running in there, and she's like, I'm sorry. You know, I'm like, glass is everywhere. And I'm like, yeah, you should be sorry. You broke all of our good plates. Just figure out, she's barefooted, just figure out how to get out of there on your own. And I just went back to work on my project I was working on, right? Why are you guys kind of going, yeah, right, no way. Why? You see, some of us have the idea that that's the way God responds to our situation. That we have messed up so bad that there's no way that God would come in and help fix it. That God is kind of like a God who points his finger like, you know, I told you shouldn't have done that. And so what's interesting is if you think that I wouldn't do that, then you think that I have more compassion than God. Therefore, that I'm more godly than God. And that's not true. And so maybe our misconception is the way that we view God, whether he's a finger-pointing God or whether he's a God who cares about the dilemma that we're in. And so I think we find the idea that, you know, just like what I did is walked in there, and I think I went and got a pair of sandals on, and I started moving glass out of the way, and I told her, jump on my back, and I carried her out of the room, and then I walked back in and was like, okay, now how are we going to clean all this up? You ever seen something like that? You know, things broke, everything's splattered everywhere. Maybe you spilled paint, and it's like, how to clean all this up? I remember my uncles worked at a factory, and they spilled soap. Gallons of soap. How do you clean that up? Couldn't take hot water to it because it just made more suds, you know. And I think they started a slip and slide contest. I don't know. But just the idea that looking at the dilemma that God came in to Abraham. And God says, I see that you see the dilemma, and I'm going to fix it through you. I mean, God could have come and go to the next slide. Nope, back up 2 slides in. The one that says out of order. I mean, God could have come in and just hung a sign on the earth and said, out of order. You guys messed it up. I've already tried to fix it once, through the flood. That didn't work. You know, things are so messed up again with Abraham that it's like, look, you know, just hang a sign on it, out of order, go somewhere else, do something somewhere else. But God didn't do that. Actually, now you can go to the slide. In 76, yeah. I was thinking, wait a minute, 1776? No, 1876 BC, Abraham shows up on the scene. Now, if you back up in Genesis chapter 11 and start there and then kind of go into the story of Abraham in chapter 12, which we're going to do today in Genesis 12, that in the story, we find that Abram's family started moving from where they were to a new place, but somewhere along the way they stopped. Now, these are nomadic people. All right, there's no cities that they developed and moved into. They just moved from one place to another where they find water and resources. And so then Abraham shows up in 1876, and God started with an idol-worshiping man who had no children, no prospect of children, to launch a nation that would touch the world. I mean, Abraham. We kind of look back at Abraham and go, man, he was a great man of faith. He was like a superhero of faith. But think about Abraham for a second. There was a story there that's written, and even the Mormons refer to this story in the Book of Mormon, which I think is interesting. And so, but in this story of Abraham, the great man of God, he goes down to Egypt because there's a famine in the land. And on his way, he realizes that I have a beautiful young wife and somebody may want her. And so he goes into this country, and the king notices his beautiful wife, and they show up and they say, "Are you married?" And Abraham already talked to Sarah about this. Said, "Look, she's beautiful. They may want her, so they'll kill me and take her. They'll take my life, and then they'll take my wife." And so when they showed up and they said, "Abraham, are you married to her? Because she's beautiful." "No, she's more like a sister." And you think you have relationship issues. She was just going to go get another, or he was just going to go get another. But the whole idea, the great man of God that he was, said, "No, she's just more like a sister." Think about this. Abraham, he wasn't this great superhero. And I think you'll find something familiar in the story that will relate to you. Look in Genesis chapter 12, verse 1. Now the Lord said to Abraham, he was out praying, talking to the Father, and God came to Abraham and said, "Go from your country, from your kindred, from your father's house to the land that I will show you." Now I think this is so cool. Because God shows up in Abraham's life and he just says, "Look, I want you to leave everything that you know, and I'm going to take you to a place you haven't even seen yet. You don't even know where you're going. I will guide your steps. I will lead you to this place." What does Abraham do? Verse 2. "And I will make you a great" what? Nation. I don't even know if he knew what a nation was. But just the idea, "I will make you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great so that you will be a blessing." And literally the translation here is a blessing to all peoples. Okay? All peoples. All right? And then verse 3. "I will bless those who" what? "Bless you. And him who dishonors you I will curse. And in you all the" what? Families of the earth will be blessed." So actually, in all reality, God gives 3 promises to Abraham. Let's look at the first one. Promise number 1 says this: "I will make you a" what? "A great nation." Now, this really didn't mean a whole lot to a nomadic family clan that's moving around from one place to another. What do you mean, great nation? The whole idea that a great nation would mean something like this. He didn't even have a child yet. Now, he has family, but God's telling him, leave your family, leave your clan, leave your tribe, go to this place that I'm going to show you, and there I will make you a great nation. That's like you calling 911 in an emergency, and the ambulance says, the ambulance operator says, "Look, we've got the engine out of the ambulance. When we get it put back together and put it back in the ambulance, then we'll show up." A great nation? You're going to start with me and build a great nation? God was doing something in the world, which means he had to do something to grab the world's attention. And we find this in the story of Abraham because he didn't even have a child yet. Anybody here know which nation? Think about it. In the 3 great faiths, Judaism says we're that great nation. We are, because we're the children of Abraham. Through Isaac and Jacob, they're our forefathers. But the Muslims say, no, we're that great nation because of the child that Abraham had through the maid of Sarah. Another great thing that a man of faith you think would not do. But the idea is that Islam says, no, we're that great nation. And then Christians say, no, we're that great nation. But here's what you can't argue. that God did that promise, that there are great nations because of Abraham. No one can argue that this didn't happen. Everybody understands that nations started from Abraham. Promise number 2. I will bless you and I will what? Make your name great. Now think about this. God is going to make His name what? Great. Now out of curiosity, how many of you before today have heard of this story of Abraham? Knew of Abraham? Practically everybody. How about this name? Show this name. Chedorlaomer. Anybody know who Chedorlaomer is? That's because you're not reading your Bible. All right? Yeah, you were here last night. But Chedorlaomer was the king of Edom. During the time of Abraham, everybody knew who Chedorlaomer was. He was a great king. And God shows up to a nobody named Abram and says, I'm going to make your name great. And He says to Chedorlaomer, a great man who everybody knows, says sorry. Isn't that interesting? That for some reason, almost 4,000 years now, mysteriously, this story of Abraham is still alive and is still taught from generation to generation. Promise number 3. And what? All the peoples on the earth will be what? Blessed through you. Everybody who lives, every people group will be blessed, will be better off. I don't know how many times I've sung this song, Father Abraham had many sons, and I did that so that it'll be stuck in your head the rest of the day, okay? And many sons had Father Abraham. Okay, the whole idea, teaching us through Vacation Bible School and all this, that all the peoples, everybody will be blessed because of Abraham. And Judaism turns and says, yes, we are blessed because of Abraham. Muslims turn and say, we are blessed because of Abraham. Christians even say that we are blessed because of Abraham. So when it comes to your personal faith testimony, okay, your journey, your starting point, something else happened with Abraham that's even more important than just the history part. Look at this. Through Abraham, God introduced a new relational equation. One night, Abraham was praying like we would pray if we were with the Lord, and He told him that you'd be a great nation, okay? And I would be happy just to be a father, Abraham is thinking. I don't have a child yet. And I'm actually too old to have children. Sarah's too old to have children. And he's praying to God and he's saying, Eliezer, my nephew or my cousin or whatever, my servant, is going to be my heir. God, you said you were going to start a great nation from me. Look at Genesis chapter 15. We'll read through a few of these verses. Chapter 15, verse 1. And these things, the word of the Lord came to Abram in a vision. Fear not, Abram, I am your shield. Your reward shall be what? Very great. Verse 2. But Abram said, O Lord, what will you give me? For I continue childless, and the heir of my house is Eliezer of Damascus. He's going to get everything. Verse 3. But Abram said, Behold, you have given me no offspring, and a member of my household will what? Will be my heir. Verse 4. And behold, God came to him and said, This man shall not be your heir. Your very what? Own son will be your heir. Your very own son will be your heir. Shall be your offspring. One of the most important statements, okay, of the entire Bible comes out of nowhere. I mean, the whole idea that up to this point, there is no law. Okay? There is no what it takes to become a follower of God. In the sense of, here's a list and let's take care of it. So if you're going to wrestle with any theological concept, okay, in the desire of a relationship with God and how it works, it comes back to this statement, okay? A factor. I mean, assuming that you can know that you know that you're in a relationship with God. Look at verse 5. And he brought him outside, and he said, look up toward the heaven and number the stars. I mean, have you ever noticed the stars? I love when we do youth hay rides. You know, as a youth minister, I would take them out to the farm, and we'd go out to the scout camp, and we'd go up there. And always, I would tell them, look up at the stars. Just take a moment. There's no side lights out there. You know, there's no street lights. It's just complete darkness. Look up at the stars. Isn't that amazing? I remember when we went to the Bahamas on a mission trip, and we were on the sailboat out in the middle of the ocean. Just laying there at night on the deck of the sailboat, looking up, seeing stars, and it's just like amazing. And then all of a sudden realizing, wait a minute, that star's moving. I was like, what's that? And the captain says, that's a satellite. I've never seen a satellite move until it was so dark, so clear, that you could see that satellite run across the sky, night after night. When we were in Africa, no street lights, no nothing, just going out there and looking at a whole different set of stars that we can't see from here. And God tells Abram, go outside of your tent, look up, and if you can count the number of stars, that's how many your offspring is going to be. Can you imagine Abraham all of a sudden at this point going, I don't even have a kid yet. I'm too old to have a child. Verse 6. Here's the unique phrase that just out of nowhere shows us the starting point of faith. He says, and he what? What did Abraham do? He believed the Lord. He believed God. Not only in the way that he believed God, I mean, it's just the fact. I mean, is that believable for you to walk out and count the stars and go, wow, if God said that to me, could I really believe that? But Abraham did. And God accounted, credited to him what? Righteousness. Because of Abram's belief in what God said, God credited his account a right standing with God. A right standing with God. So in other words, look at it like this. Look at the next slide. Trusting God resulted in a right standing with God. Trusting God resulted in a right standing with God. Righteousness comes by what? Faith. I mean, this is before the Ten Commandments. This is before, different religions put different labels on what needs to be done. God labeled Abram righteous, not because of what he had done, but because he believed and he trusted God, and therefore God gave him a right standing. You see, we have been conditioned, we have been trained completely the opposite. We feel like we have to obey the rules. We feel like we have to do certain things in order to be accepted by God, that we have to do all of this stuff to appease God, and then hopefully God works it out. See, that's what's unique, is that the Jews would eventually even embrace this posture. That the idea that in Abraham's lineage, for one to be guaranteed a relationship with God, he needed to obey the rules. That he needed to keep the commandments. I mean, they even told Jesus that. The religious leaders told Jesus, but what about the commandments? You've got to do all of this stuff. And it wasn't just the 10 that they kept. They actually added another 600 or something beyond that in order for you to know that if you're in a right standing with God, that you need to keep this. Even if Gentiles, or heathens, or people who weren't born Jewish, if they wanted to believe in the Jewish God, then they had to do all of these certain rules and things that needed to be done in order for them to be counted as God's children. I mean, even Jesus, when he showed up on the scene, said, talked about a relationship with God, and the Jews said, we don't need a relationship with God because we are the children of God because of Abraham. The prophet Muhammad showed up 600 years later after Jesus' resurrection and began putting things together and said, if you want a right standing with God, with Allah, then you need to do all of these good works, okay? And in all of these good works, okay, when you enter into that point, when death comes, then Allah is going to measure your good works against your bad works, and whichever one weighs out, okay, Allah will determine at that point what your reward is. Christians, not too long after Jesus died and His resurrection, shows up on the scene and even does the same thing in the sense of, if you want to be a Christian, then you've got to obey the commandments. You've got to be circumcised. You've got to be all this stuff. And there was a big argument that broke out and said, wait a minute, they don't even know what it means. The commandments. They don't even know what it means to be circumcised. They don't understand what you're trying to say. And the whole idea that even all three faiths got away from the point that trusting God was as simple as it is. I mean, even the fact that Christians said, it's simply believe, and everybody was saying, no, that's too hard. That's too easy. So look at it like this. The Jews would eventually embrace the posture. Muslims, Christians, okay, go to the next slide. All of them said that there's these certain rules, certain ways in order for you to have a right standing with God. But what if religion has made it more complicated than it's supposed to be? I mean, it doesn't matter whether you've been to a mosque, whether you've been to church, or even people like me, preachers who get up and say, well, you got to do all of this stuff. What if the starting point, what if this is the pattern of a relationship with God, of just trusting? What if the starting point for a relationship with God is trust? Basically, simply, just trust. I mean, God, 4,000 years ago, made it so simple. What if a single expression of trust, like Abram said, I believe? It just seems too easy, right? It seems too cheap, too free, too unlike anything else we've ever experienced in our life. Why would our high God make such a low standard for us? Why would He put the cookies on the bottom shelf for us to get to? Look at it like this. As you start or restart, you need to wrestle with this question. On what grounds, if any, will God find me acceptable? On what grounds, if any, will God find me acceptable? Do I have to jump through all these hoops? Do I have to do all of this stuff? Do I have to be the right person at the right time? Do I have to, help all of these people? Do I have to, do this? Do I have to do this with my family? I mean, what is it? Could it be this? Go to the next slide. Is it birth? I even had a guy come to me and said, well, my parents were Christians and my grandparents were Christians, so therefore I'm a Christian. Just like the Jews. We were born from Abraham. Does that make you a Christian? What if it's behavior? Like the Muslims say, well, if you do all of these good things, even the church I grew up in said you had to do all of this good stuff in order to appease God, and He'll make it happen. Or if it's belief. Or if it's a combination of all three things. So here's the question I really want you to wrestle with. Here's the question this week. I want you to wrestle with this question for a restart of your faith. This next slide. What if the starting point for a relationship with God is simply trust? Simply trust. You're like, well, what does that look like? It's trust. Simply believe. Many years ago, I went back up to the cave. I grew up out by Lake Weddington. And there's a cave up there on my neighbor's place that we'd go and camp out and hang out and do all this stuff. And that's where I accepted Christ. That's where the preacher took the guys. We told him about it, and he said, let's do a camp out. Went up there, and the next day, the next morning he did a little devotion. He said, if you want to come over here and talk to me about anything, come over and talk to me. And my cousin turned to me and said, I've been telling you need to accept Christ. Here's the point. And so I go over there and I sat with him, and that was when I was about 7. Now, the same cousin who introduced me to Jesus when I was around 7 introduced me to marijuana when I was around 12. I was introduced to drinking when I was 8. And so the whole idea is that, I wrestled with if I was really saved, I wouldn't do all that stuff. I wouldn't do all that bad things. But I grew up in a family that's what they did. I grew up in a culture that it was very acceptable. But every time I go to church, I'd feel so guilty. And I'm like, I don't know what I need to do. And so a lot of times I just wrestle with my faith. Am I really saved? Because if I was really saved, I wouldn't do all that bad stuff, right? Bad things wouldn't happen to me if I was really saved. And so one day, wrestling with this, I finally went back to that spot in that cave and I sat down. And I said, God, here I am. And this is what I'm putting my faith in. I sat here when I was 7, and I trust you. I believe in your death, your burial, your resurrection. And then I got up and walked away. Now, everything from that moment on has been peachy keen in my life, right? No. But I can go back to that point, and I had a restart. I had to sit down and go, okay, this is it. Even this week, I'm driving the truck and I hear somebody preaching on the radio or on the podcast I'm listening to, and I have that little sneaking thing that comes into my life going, what if you're really not saved? What if God's really not real? And I just immediately go back to that point and go, I'm trusting Him. What other option do I have? I've tried other things. You've tried other things. Maybe it's just a point where you can sit down and maybe you can go to the same spot. Maybe you can't. Maybe you just need to sit down and go, God, I am trusting you. I don't even know what that looks like yet. Abraham had no idea where he was going, but God led him to a land. And God made a great people, a great nation from one family. Actually, if you think about it, I think this is so cool. God chose Abraham at the latter years of his life when he couldn't have children. He took something that was really dead and he made it alive, and they had a child. They had a son, Isaac. And from that, nations grew. Next week we'll look at the role of rules in our life and how that really affects us when we think about the commandments. Because are they important? Because we've been taught. How does rules and relationship all come together? We'll get a look at that next week. But maybe the starting point for your faith this week is wrestling with this question. What if it's just trust? I know some of you have no doubt. You trust very easy. My pastor friend Earl, he said, I've never doubted my salvation. I said, I have all my entire life, But I doubt everything in my life. That's just kind of the person I am. And he's not. What if it's just trust? And that may look a little bit different for you than it does for me. Maybe you decide, I'm trusting and I'm good. Or maybe you're like, I don't know. I just have to get up every morning and go, retrust, all right? I'm retrusting you, God, today. My world just fell apart, but I'm going to trust you. However that works, however that looks in your life. But I can know this. If we agree with what the Bible says, in Romans 10, 9, and 10, he makes it very simple. Paul does. He says, if we confess with our mouth that Jesus is the Lord, our Master, and we believe in our heart, we believe in our life, we have that trust that God raised Him from the dead, we shall be saved. Because with the confession, okay, it's with our hearts that we believe and are made righteous because of our trust. That right standing with God. It's with our mouth that confession is made unto salvation. It can really be that simple. So I'm going to give you an opportunity this morning. If you've never had that opportunity to say, God, I really believe that you came, that you died for my sins through Jesus, that He resurrected, and I'm just going to trust you. It can be that simple of a prayer to start your faith or to restart your faith. So if you would, just bow your head and close your eyes for a moment. I'm just going to give you an opportunity for you just to talk to God just like I did, just like I do, and just say, God, I trust you. Maybe this morning your world is falling apart and you don't understand why things are going the way they are, but you can just say, God, I trust you. Maybe things are going awesome for you and you can just say, God, I'm going to continue to trust you. Maybe you've never had that opportunity to say, God, come in and be Lord of my life. Because I'm going to trust you to guide me, to be my master, to lead me through life.